Hello, everybody. I'm Derek Arden, and welcome to Monday Night Live. Tonight, I've got a very special guest from near Seattle in California who was actually born in Saudi Arabia. How about that? Born in Saudi Arabia to a Muslim father and an Italian mother. Wow, in this day and age. Jasmin, congratulations. Thanks for joining us. Let me just tell you a little bit about Jasmin. For the first 25 years of Jasmin's life, she navigated the complexities of bicultural identity. I hadn't heard of that word before we had a rehearsal yesterday, but seems to make sense to me in one of the most conservative regimes in the world. Her escape was dramatic, and she's going to tell us a little bit about that, wearing a burqa to leave the country. She settled in America, becoming an American citizen 9 years later. Her mum's still in Saudi Arabia with her brother. Jasmin, thanks for joining us. I hope I got the introduction right. It's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Derek, for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure. And I will just correct one thing. I'm in the state of Washington, not California. That's
Oh,
the
okay.
only
Well, I'm a Brit, and it's all
just to
yeah.
make sure that people don't think there is a Seattle down there. We are unique.
Okay, well, it's the other side of the pond to us, the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
Correct.
What's that lovely dog's name that's standing behind you, watching what's going on?
That is Miss Gaia, Gaia Louise. Yep, she's very regal and thinks she's the star.
Okay. Well, you're going to share a presentation and some fantastic photos with us. So if you want to share your screen and take it away, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you so much, everyone, for having me and for tuning in and listening. I am going to pull over here a just a few slides so I can give you a visual as I tell you my story. Um, I always like to start by, kind of introducing myself. And as Derek kindly said, being a bicultural person, a bi-ethnic person is always a confusing phrase because people often think of biracial or they think of, um, you know, the concept in the United States, which is really a little different from the way the rest of the world sees multiculturalism. But as Derek has said, I was born to an Arab Muslim father and an Italian Roman Catholic origins mother during a time that much newness was happening in the world. And so before I get started, I just want you to kind of picture, just to kind of build up where I'm going to be taking you along this journey. I want you to think about a possibility in your life where you kind of pictured the impossible and not really thinking that you could ever attain that impossible. And that's kind of where I thought I would land for the rest of my life. Ever since I had a memory from the age of maybe 2, 3, and seriously that far away, I knew that something was different and odd about my life, and I knew that there was going to be some kind of confusing mystery as I continued to grow because I could just simply feel the pull that I had towards a life and a destiny that I wanted for myself because I got to see it either in movies or in my travels, of course, as I grew up and as I became a teenager, and just dreaming and fantasizing of the impossible, knowing that the only way to attain it was to get myself through a really dangerous and risky predicament. So if you have a time in your life where you think you have kind of faced this, fantastic. Use that as we journey and talk together. If you haven't, then I invite you to think about the experiences that some of us have in the world and how forgotten these stories tend to be. So I'll start at the very beginning, the origins. My parents, as I had mentioned, come from two vastly different cultures. My father, who you can see circled in the red where the young men are, and that picture is about 16, 17 years old with some of his buddies. My father was born in Hail in Saudi Arabia, the very northern part of Saudi Arabia, super traditional, very, very desert life, still very much out of the city peripheries. And he was born right around the time that Saudi Arabia was established, which is the late 1930s, the current iteration of Saudi Arabia, because there had been attempts prior to that. The current iteration of Saudi Arabia was founded and the kingdom was established in the late 1930s. And my father, growing up, was a very studious, super intelligent young man. His teachers kind of noticed there was something special about him. And so when time came after Saudi Arabia discovered the oil in the 1950s and the riches of the country made it clear that they had to build this country from within, they selected a large group of young Saudi men who showed ambition, who showed bright, intelligent aspirations, and sent them all over the world to study and bring back the riches that they attained from the West primarily, but not just the West, the East as well, and to build this newfound country. My father selected Italy, Florence to be specific, because he was very interested in architecture and interior design, and that's where he landed. My mother, on the other hand, you can see in that picture, the tiny little person that I circled, she was born right after World War II in 1944, 10 years almost after her older sister was born, during a time when Italy was figuring itself out again, trying to get its footing. And my mom was actually born in the south, in the southern part of Italy, in a region called Potenza, just south of Naples, where my grandparents are originally from, which is Southern Italian family. And right after her birth, because of the changes and the adjustments and the lifestyle that my grandfather wanted to afford my aunt and my mother, they moved up north to Florence she was about 2 years old, and that's where they remained, and that's where she was educated. So fast forward to the time in which they are now in their youth, and they are kind of both exploring. My father, you can see in the picture there, just that's a picture from his passport, as he, first passport probably for many of these young Saudi men, set his sails towards Italy and headed over there in the early 1960s. My mother, who was a very kind of ambitious woman, and I don't think she ever even thought of herself as that way, but she was a very modern post-World War II woman, and had interest and ambition in journalism, multilinguistics, and she was multilingual, or is multilingual. But my grandfather was also very traditional, and so she did not have kind of the freedoms and liberties that maybe most Italian girls in the North had. There's still the traditional Southern way of thinking, the very conservative way of thinking. So she snuck away one night with a friend of hers to a party for Christmas, or it was a New Year's party, and walked in, and this, gaggle of young men walked in. Most of the girls just thought they were typical Italian boys or Southern Italian boys. And my mom and my father kind of saw each other, and it was that, across the room, love at first sight. My mom, joked and said she thought he was just a guy from Sicily. She didn't realize that he was Arab, and she immediately thought, that's the man I'm going to marry. And lo and behold, since then, the rest is history, as I say. The thing that I always like to highlight at this point is that this is not just a traditional love story or a common love story. This was really the love story of the first of its kind for these cross-cultural romances during a generation where none had happened prior. So I like to emphasize that, because I think it's valid to recognize that up until that point, there was no manual. There was, of course, no internet. There was no way to look up how to navigate these very interesting and intricate stories. So when you meet and fall in love and you see each other, it's all wonderful and rosy. But this is also a generation that did not talk about, what is life going to look like? What is it going to feel like if we are to create this family together? What is all of this going to mean, or how will it impact the children that will be born out of these marriages? None of those conversations happened at the time. And honestly, even into my adulthood, I don't think the generation of our parents even feel the necessity, the value, or even the urgency to have this conversation. When we bring it up as the generation of these kids that were born, there's much, I think, a little bit of resistance and a little bit of, I don't want to say guilt, because I don't think they feel guilty, but I think they just simply can't understand that there was a really tragic impact on us. And so in this picture, you can see some of those moments of the 1960s and the romances in multiple groups down there. The photo below has pictures that out of respect, just because I don't have permission to use people's photos, I did definitely covered their faces. But these were couples that I knew growing up. Also, they also became like aunts and uncles to me, because these were all Italian women who married all of these young Saudi men. And so what happened after that? The transition and the journey continued, and the new beginnings arose when my parents finally got married in 1969. And the decision was to move to Saudi Arabia and build a life and a family there. There was never a thought that the family would be raised in Italy. The assumption was that this was going to happen in Saudi Arabia. And so my grandfather, I will give much credit to, my Italian grandfather, encouraged my mother to actually go visit the Middle East before marrying this man and moving. And I will say my Italian family embraced my father very lovingly and very openly, and there was never any kind of resistance to him being part of the family. So my mother, with her mother, traveled to Lebanon to go explore and kind of get a feel for Middle Eastern life, even though Lebanon is not your most ideal place to get a feel for that, because it is and was, especially at the time, very, very modern and progressive. I will also highlight here, speaking of Lebanon, prior to the young Saudi men who left to go abroad to study, many of them had grown up in these extremely conservative and very, very primitive situations. My father grew up in a mud adobe house that he built with his brothers and his father. So many of them had never seen uncovered women, um, post-industrial inventions, cars, many of those things. And so to acclimate them before sending them and shipping them off to Europe, to the US and India and Pakistan, they actually sent them to modern, slightly progressive and westernized Arab countries like Egypt and Lebanon, just so they could see women uncovered, just so they could see cars, just so they could see a life that was so different from theirs before they arrived in their destination where they were going to spend a few years to study and acclimate a little easier with that. And so my mom did a similar thing, crash course into the Middle East through one of the more modern countries and just get a feel for what is that going to be like. And so both of them kind of, I think, without even knowing they were doing this, were sort of tasting and checking out what that life was going to look like. And I think that really set the standard of success for both of them, where they never actually felt like there was something odd or unusual or really challenging and difficult. And I admire that generation because they faced challenges and newness and difficulty with such casualty, while we now can see the world that we live in is so much more sensitive, delicate, and fragile to change and challenge. So this is another sample of photographs of my father's, family. This is it. People often think that now when you look at Saudi Arabia and you look at other modern Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and places like that, where it is very much a resemblance of what the West looks like. And that's true. But these origins and these beginnings, first of all, still do exist in many parts of the country. And second of all, definitely were not that long ago. This is my father's generation. And so in these pictures, you can see I've also covered the women here because out of respect to my aunts and my cousins, primarily because they would never show their faces uncovered in front of other men. And so out of respect to them, I covered them. But you can see how my mom was so eager to acclimate. She really embraced the lifestyle. She thought it was charming and fascinating and exotic and all of those labels that you can think of. And she definitely felt drawn to acclimate and to assimilate. And she did a great job at it. They loved her. They embraced her. It was all very smooth on both sides of these, very drastically different families. And so then the generation of children begins, these, wonderful marriages that seemed to flow seamlessly and smoothly. All the families involved seemed to be okay with it. There was much acceptance. And I will highlight here, one of the reasons why many of these marriages were seamless and smooth is because at the time, and maybe still today, we don't think of the differences in our cultural practices as a potential, as a potential glitch or as a potential challenge. Oftentimes when we think of marriages back in the day and still today, we always think of racial mixed marriages and how the impact of that is far more serious. And I think once there wasn't that concern, because even though my father was Arab, my mother's Italian, ethnically, yes, they're different, but I mean, racially, there wasn't that drastic of a difference. We look like both of our parents. There wasn't the challenge that people face where they are in biracial relationships. I think once that wasn't a concern, no one thought of, well, how will the impact of religion and language and culture and tradition, influence these relationships and these families? And so we arrived and slowly started to kind of look around and question. I say in my memoir that, as early as, like I said, 2 or 3 years old, I can tell my mom was different and didn't belong there. Even though she was loved and revered and welcomed and all of those things, I could still see that she looked different, sounded different. She was fluent in Arabic as well. She learned very quickly the language, added to the many other languages she spoke. But I could tell that there was something different about my mother. She sounded different. She looked different. She behaved different. Her practices were different. And so even though she converted to Islam and again assimilated in every way, I always had this feeling, this nagging feeling that she could be taken away from me. completely irrational. But as a child, and it came out of nowhere, it just came innately. So that anxiety started very early. That fear, that sense of loss, that sense of longing, all of those things just impacted in a way that I never ever imagined. Derek.
When did she tell you that she was from Italy? When did she fess up to it all?
Oh, I was never told. It was a fact that we just figured out. We were all fluent. Italian was our first language, so I knew I spoke Italian. I went to Italy and visited my family. I don't think they ever told us. As we grew up, they would tell us snippets of like when we met and things like that. But I don't ever remember being told anything. It was just that's what we learned. I do remember though that when my Italian, or I'm sorry, my Saudi cousins and uncles and aunts would ask me, when we'd visit, they'd ask us, what do you like more, Saudi Arabia or Italy? And that was a kind of a question that they, thought was fun or silly, and we were different. And I naturally, the first time I answered, I said Italy. And my mom, later said to me, don't ever say that. You can just say both. You don't have to, don't say Italy, don't exclude Italy. And I was really confused by that, but I understood where she was coming from, obviously, as I grew up and matured. But in my head, I thought it was really interesting that there was kind of a dance that we had to dance. There was this measuring of how we communicate and how we interact that was really important. And later on, I learned it's because the culture is so immersed in, some might call hypocrisy, others might call decorum. You can see it both ways because there's both the people who tend to be hypocritical, but also the people who tend to just be kind and gentle and over the top, riddled with decorum and formalities. And so it is a navigation that you have to really think of very, very carefully. And again, no one tells you, no one teaches you. You just figure it out as you emulate and you imitate and you see how other people are behaving, and you sort of parrot their behavior and their words. So as life, continued, and as those thoughts kept emerging and the traveling back and forth, I could see the major differences, the way my father dressed when we were in Italy versus how he dressed when we were, at home in Saudi Arabia. My Italian grandparents were just open and loving and affectionate. My grandmother on my father's side, my maternal grandmother, I never met. She passed away before my father ever even married. But I met my paternal grandfather. He died when I was about 5 or 6. So I really have very, very, very few memories of him. I do remember he was loving and affectionate, but again, very reserved, very conservative, just a very different energy. So I grew up, for me, love and family and connectedness and physical affection came from my Italian family. My Saudi family was, formal and traditional and fairly, culturally immersed in the practices of life, which included, once girls hit puberty, that separation between men and women, the covering for men, not really having time to spend with my cousins, or casually living the same way I lived when I went to Italy. So it was this duality that kept me in this space of absolute confusion, yet at the same time it was normal. And of course, when puberty knocks on the door, you start to wonder, what does this all mean for me? Because now I really have a visual of what life can look like. Do I want to live my life, immersed in what now has been told to me is my reality, is my life, this is my future, there's no arguing it. The interesting thing is at that time, the frustration of having this like desire and this interest and this passion to pursue a life that felt more innately and more natural to my way of being, which would have been in the West, would have been in Italy, would have been, outside of the norms of being covered and hidden and all of those things. There was no possibility for me to say when I travel or when I, move abroad, or none of that. It was, you're going to marry a Saudi man, you're going to have a Saudi family. Even though my parents had a choice how they wanted to do their life and their marriage and their way of upbringing their life. For girls, that was never a choice. Boys could go ahead and aspire to make a decision, whatever that looks like. Other young men were moving abroad and studying and marrying Western women, but no girls were doing that. No young women were doing that. The women were expected to uphold that traditional Saudi life, even though in our home, my parents were fairly progressive. So those were some of the things that started to kind of plague me, the concerns and the worries and the fears that this is sort of a life I'm doomed to. And To describe the feeling of desperation is impossible. I can definitely go and immerse myself in that feeling because it was so like fully embodied in my entire system. Uh, the only escape for me at the time was, listening to music, dancing. I was obsessed with Michael Jackson, so that became my escape in my bedroom. I would tell stories to myself, daydream, fantasize. And at the time, there was the big movement of New Age and the positive thinking and law of attraction and all those things. And my mom had secretly fallen into that world. And so publicly, we were sort of living the life of Norm, but personally and in our private little world, there was kind of this spiritual awakening, this kind of new way of thinking. And I remember thinking, well, I can create this life that I want for myself. I just have to visualize it. I just have to really believe it. I have to create it in my head. I have to feel it in my body so that I can then create it. And I spent, of course, the majority of my teens kind of building towards that. I will fast forward because the story obviously is too long to share all of it here. But I will fast forward that in the early 1990s, I met a young Saudi man who was much like me, very westernized. He was Saudi but was born in the U.S. and raised in the U.S. and spent most of his childhood and adolescence in the U.S. So we happened to meet secretly through a mutual friend, and you know people may say fall in love. Well, we didn't fall in love. We fell into what we thought was a mutual convenience because he wanted a somewhat modernized woman. I needed a man that was not going to be a traditional man. And so we did get married at a very early age. I was 19 years old when we got married and he was 20. And we lived 6 years of kind of what you would call here girlfriend, boyfriend. We should have just lived together or gotten to know each other or dated, but we had to get married because legally there you cannot just live with someone. So that marriage did not last very long. Obviously, I go into details in my memoir about that. But during that time, we traveled a lot. And one of the places we went to is the US, of course, because that was his home. And I grew up fantasizing of everything about America because I had never been there. I'd only been to Europe. Disney World and Disneyland and Disney movies were my escape. They were my just my path to joy and my path to dreaming, much like Walt Disney said, you dream and you create these beautiful magical experiences, and that had really become very real to me. So of course when I arrived in the United States for the first time as a visitor, in my head I was like, I can't imagine living anywhere else but in this like world of freedom and world of absolute possibility. Well, fast forward, um when my marriage ended with my first husband, I started plotting this escape to the Americas, whether it was Canada, whether it was the US. And I did have a very dear friend in Canada, and I kind of started talking to her secretly if I could just find a way to get out of here, because the big piece was getting out, crossing that border, because no woman can leave Saudi Arabia without permission from her guardian male, who is either your father, your husband, your brother, depending on who that guardian is, and then being able to get that permission to escape. Well, building up to that, as I was planning and plotting this escape, which took several months or a little over a year, I met and fell in love with an American man there who was American, much older than me. There was just like all of these absolute, red flags why this relationship would never be something that I could dream of. And yet, love is so powerful that you absolutely can't, you can't push that back. And so while I was planning my escape, he too said, well, let's just do this together. And not together, but kind of uh, together in thought and in planning, we found a way to get out. I go into details and I'm happy to answer questions about that, but basically I had to find a way to manipulate my father into giving me permission to actually be able to leave, because I could not leave without that letter. I could not leave without his permission, and my passport could not have I could not have that visa to go to the US without it. And so with much thought and much thinking and much planning and much plotting, I was able to solicit my Italian cousin's help, who's like a brother to me, and just kind of ask him to tell my father that he was going to the US with his family and he wanted me to travel with them so that I can get that letter and that visa to the United States. And I will also say that prior to my crossing the border and leaving Saudi Arabia, many women have attempted to escape, whether with a lover or whether on their own, and they were always caught at the airport, and the ramifications of that were always very, very dramatic. And so I knew the risk I was taking when I was going, but at that point, I was already divorced. I was damaged goods, as they say, because I was no longer desired virgin for any Saudi man. I would have been a second or third wife at that point at only 25 years of age. And my ambitions and my aspirations to what my life could have looked like were non-existent. And so it was a risk I was willing to take between being madly in love and really desperately wanting my freedom. I went ahead and did it. And that day at the airport, when I finally made it to the airport and was within minutes to get on that plane to leave forever, I could see the religious police walking by at the airport because they are always there. They're always monitoring. They're always checking behavior, questioning people. My heart was pulsating. My legs were shaking. And I was covered from head to toe because in public, you're always covered. I was pulled to the women's side where I had to be, checked and security and all of that. And so they checked that, you have to uncover and do all those things. And again, I had no reason to believe that they would be suspicious of me other than being able to read my thoughts or know what my plans are, which of course they couldn't do. But that level of anxiety was just absolutely debilitating and paralyzing. I finally got on the plane the minute that plane took off, and I intentionally chose to fly on a US airline, or I'm sorry, a European airline. I was on Swiss Air, not Saudi airline or not any airline where I could, potentially be taken back. And so the moment that plane was up in the air, I finally shed everything. I did not want to look or resemble like anything of my past. And I landed safely in Italy prior to leaving completely to the United States. So the escape happened. What happens beyond that? My life since then, it's been 26 years since that first moment of leaving Saudi Arabia. I have never gone back. I have been in the United States for 26 years. And while I'd love to say that everything was smooth and just like I pictured it, of course, challenges happen. Many of the things that I started to do for the first time, I did because I was never able to do them before, like skiing, like talking to men, like, opening up a bank account, like all of those things where women can't do when they're living in a very repressive and oppressive country. Driving was one of the first things I learned to do because in all the years that I dreamed about being in the driver's seat, as you can see from these silly pictures, driving did not become legal in Saudi Arabia until 2018. So it's something to really behold. I finally became a citizen 9 years after my arrival. And part of that is because 9/11 happened, and being a Saudi citizen, many of the applicants to citizenship in the United States after 9/11 from the Middle East and primarily from Saudi Arabia were really challenged. And so I was one of those many, but luckily, even after being married to an American man and having American children, it did take that long. And I finally became a citizen and revoked my Saudi citizenship. This all boils down to our stories and what they mean to us. And my conclusion here is to say that in these challenges and in these really tough times, the only thing we can foster from all of this is resilience, is courage, is bravery, is strength. Even when we think it's not happening, even when we think we don't have it or we don't know where to pull from it, it is miraculous. And I will just pause here and say that in the world that we live in today, we notice that everyone is, falling apart, everyone's upset, everyone is, feeling the pain and the anguish of their own story. And it makes me really sad because what I notice is that people are not taking advantage of the hardships and the challenges and the struggles in their stories and in their lives in order to become resilient and strong and move forward so that they can not only build a better life for themselves, but also work by example for others. I think the world has sort of flipped in a very self-centered space, and it does make me really concerned about the next generation because resilience is really the way to go when it comes to being able to really move past all of our challenges. And so anecdotally, here are some of the things that I can tell you that have really become, have become a big part of my building resilience is my education, really committing to being educated and learned and open-minded. My activism in the sense that I like to lend voice to where things are, unjust and where we need to be more open-minded about it, gaining strength and courage and all of the aspects of our lives that we take for granted in the West that we don't realize are just simple things that really give you the path to the world. And so the work that I do today is really focused on that. I work exclusively in the areas of bridging cultural understanding, pushing the extremism and extremist ideologies on any side of the political social aisle. I'm really committed to making sure that we are really paying attention and listening to the people we maybe don't know, sometimes disagree with, oftentimes judge and reject. So my work really falls in that space of trying very hard to push the boundaries, sometimes with a lot of resistance and other times by being canceled and, and people getting upset and all that. But I think it is worth the push, because if I was able to push against a regime and a government that is the most oppressive and repressive in the world, really no other social movement scares me. And so I will continue to push in that direction, because I do believe in the work of bridging gaps and becoming more tolerant and understanding and accepting and open-minded. And so with that, I thank you for, riding along with me in the journey. I will pause here and give you a little bit of information if you'd like to know more and follow me and check out. And I'm always happy to hear from folks when they email me directly, message me. My memoir is called The Last Sandstorm. It's available everywhere if you're interested. If not, just a conversation with me would be super welcome. I'm also on all the social media stuff. And I thank you all. Derek, I welcome your questions if you have any.
Jasmin, thank you so much. That was an absolutely brilliant presentation. And what a story. I felt your anxiety as you told the story about the religious police at Riyadh Airport as well. It gave me a bit of goosebumps and a bit of fear. Couple of quick questions
Sure.
before we stop the recording, because we're almost out of time. Your mum, you told me that your mum came to America, but she's now stuck in Saudi. Can
Oh,
you?
yeah. I wouldn't say stuck. It's by choice. My mom loved her life in Saudi Arabia. So she's gone back and forth. She's traveled a lot. She's, spent time all over. She came and spent time here in the US with me, especially when my children were younger, just to be sort of participatory in their lives. And so she, that is that is her choice. I respect and admire her decision to live the life that she wants. And for her, it was never a burden, never. She's lived joyfully there. So I definitely want to highlight that, because it's my story is very different from hers, and we're very different people.
And what about your dad?
My father passed away in 2018.
Sorry.
I never saw him after I left. I left in 1999, so I never saw him. I never embraced him again. For the first few years, he definitely could not wrap his mind around my decision. And I don't think it was because he was a tyrant of a father. Not at all. He was super loving, very affectionate. I think he was heartbroken by my decision. Again, during a time where no one would have done this, but now it's become so common. My other sister moved here. My older brother moved here, and so it's become a very common thing. But I did, I did reconcile with him after my first son was born, and FaceTimed with him, videoed with him, and talked to him often on the phone until he passed away.
Okay, fantastic. Well, you're in the company of very positive people. First of all, and some people will tell you that I have a negativity bell. No negativity is allowed on this show, because I share your feelings about negativity. I'm very positive about what's going forward, because I think we should be. You live in the richest country in the world. We live in the sixth richest country in the world by GDP. And again, why is everybody negative? They should go and live somewhere else where there's no food on the table. But don't get me started on that. And we share the
Mhm.
same issues, as does the people that read my newsletter and come on this show. Jasmin, thank you so much for joining us on Monday Night Live. That's been a real inspiration. And can I ask members of, while I put you on gallery view of Monday Night Live, to give you the usual round of
Mhm.
applause for
Thank you so much.
doing that.
Thank you.
And
My pleasure.
just remind everybody, if they do want to get in touch with you or hear your story or just have a chat with you, how they get in touch with you, presumably on LinkedIn, I guess. Is that the easiest way?
Yes. So I am on LinkedIn. I am also on Instagram. I do not use Facebook very much. I think I have a page there, but it's primarily just for my book. So Instagram, LinkedIn are my two primary social medias. But my website, it's just jasminfaulk.com. You can contact me through there. My email is on there, but also a contact page. So there are many, many ways in which you can get in touch with me. And I would love, love, love to stay in touch.
I've got a copy of Jasmin's ebook. It's very difficult to get over here and very expensive. I think it's because it's on Amazon.com rather than
Mhm.
Amazon.co.uk. But Jasmin's ebook is there. Jasmin, Thanks for joining us. I hope you'll come back and join us, and join us any Monday Night Live when you want a good dose of inspiration, motivation, leadership, or negotiation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It'd be my honor and my pleasure. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Derek.